well, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. My name is Kristen Kusek, and I'm so lucky to be the moderator for this evening's panel discussion. I'm Director of Strategic Communications at the USF College of Marine Science, and really excited to be joining Dr. Tom Frazer, Kendall Fitzgerald, and Paige Lansky this evening. What I thought I would do is start out with just a brief introduction to kind of get us all together on the same page. And then we'll get right into our talks this evening. And then we'd like to end with some actions that we can all take individually and collectively on behalf of the environment. Tonight's really about hope. And at the very end, if you're still with us and not starving for dinner yet, we'd like to lead you in a Q&A with our panelists. So with that, I'll get started. Okay, as I said, guys, tonight is about restoring the environment. To me, that really means finding hope. And tonight we're really talking about science. So finding hope in art and science. Our shared worry list this evening is long. I don't need to read you these things that we're all concerned about that prompted this awesome exhibit at Florida Craft Art. Shown here, I just thought this was a particularly interesting one. This picture of an iguana. This is an iguana who shouldn't live here. But does now in our area in St. Pete, Florida, and Tampa Bay more broadly. He belongs further south, but as the climate is shifting and climate ecosystems are shifting, he now lives up here. He should be way down south. So my colleague who gave me this picture likes to say, if you don't believe in climate change, just look at the animals. They're doing what instincts tell them to do. And this is a guy who really shouldn't live here. So he's more of a tropical species, but our climate here is becoming much more tropical in nature, as we all know. The other image in the background might be familiar to some of you. It shows the flooding in Coffee Pot Bayou, which is always a concern. So I wanted to share with you a quick story about one of my biggest concerns about the environment, and one that's reflected in the exhibit, which I was really encouraged by, because it's a big one. I was lucky enough to be on this expedition several years ago to the whole point. I was sailing with a group of Norwegian scientists in the Arctic, so going to a really remote place. And our mission was to find the first ever hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean in the Arctic Circle. And we did that. But on the way, I was lucky enough to see this place called Jan Mayen, which not many people know about. And it's the world's northernmost active volcano. As you see on the map, it's a little fuzzy, but you can just see how remote this place is. So remote that you can see what people do there for work. The point is, those are all zeros. Nobody lives there. Okay, so there's no people there. So in my career, this was one of the most remote and exciting places I ever got to see. This is what it looked like from the ship. Okay, just gorgeous, right? That arrow points to me. I almost died from the survival suit that we had to wear getting to the island from the ship because it was so big on me. But this is what it looked like when we first got there, and it really felt like we were on another planet. It really did. It felt very special until we turned the corner, and that's what we saw. So as you see, plastics, discarded stuff from fishing vessels, I guess. And it was just really depressing to me because I thought, wow, if ever there's a pristine place on the planet, it's this. But in fact, not the case. And as we know now, not only are plastics at that, the top of the world, if you will, but they're at the very bottom of the ocean. This core crustacean was even named after plastics in 2020. And he was found in the Mariana Trench, as deep as you can go in the ocean. So it's a big problem. But Katie reminded me, she said, make this about hope. It's not about doom and gloom tonight, Kristen. So with that in mind, I wanted to share just a couple experiences of my own from my own career that's to share some hope in this space. And that is when I used to work up in Boston at an institute at Harvard, they were developing a really interesting bioplastic that's made from proteins from shrimp shells and silk. And they actually called it shrilk. So this was really encouraging, and we did an experiment, as you can see in the top left there, where that's the bioplastic on the bottom there, and we were able to grow plants in it. So to me, this gives me hope. This is a cool development, and I'm following it along to see where it goes. Just last week, hot off the presses, I also worked at one point at Woods Hole, which is a big oceanographic institute up in Cape Cod. And they just released an interesting study that shows that the breakdown of plastics in sunlight is actually much more complex than we ever thought before, whereby it breaks down into many more sort of sub-products. What's neat about that is it could potentially inform the development of new plastics, should we still have to do that, because we kind of do right now, but in a way that would lend themselves to breaking down more easily in the environment. So two areas of hope in that really tough problem of plastics, which are just pervasive. So with that, I want to hand it off now to our speakers, and I'm going to introduce each one of them. And we will start this evening with Dr. Tom Frazer, who is Professor and Dean of the College of Marine Science here at USF. Before that, he was Director of the School of Natural Resources and the Environment at University of Florida. And he served as the Chief Science Officer for the state of Florida. Dr. Frazer holds a bachelor's degree in fisheries biology from Humboldt State University, master's from University of Florida, and his PhD in biological sciences from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's received more than 15 million in research funding to address all sorts of topics, from water quality to nutrient dynamics, fish population dynamics, food web interactions, the list goes on. He's conducted research in freshwater and saltwater systems and can speak to you about almost any environmental topic facing the state of Florida. He has co-authored or authored more than 175 peer-reviewed publications and currently serves as chair of the Gulf of Mexico Fisheries Management Council. Tonight, he's going to tell you a story about lionfish. So I hope you enjoy it.
All right. Well, thanks to all the folks at Florida Craft Art, Katie in particular, and Kristen for letting me come and chat a little bit about art and science. And what I wanted to do is just talk about lionfish, in large part because they're probably among the most colorful and ornate marine fishes in the world, and they're the subjects of painters and sculptors and photographers. And but the issue with lionfish is that they don't belong here, right? And but they showed up in Miami, just off the coast of Miami in the early 1990s. Some people say late 80s. They kind of moved their way up the Atlantic seaboard in the early 2000s. And then in the last decade or so, they were really well established throughout the broader Caribbean region, including the Gulf of Mexico. And so if you go to the next slide. So we don't know a lot about lionfish because they don't live here, right? Again, they're native to the Indo-Pacific. And but what we do know is that they mature really early, and we know that from our biological sampling, and they reproduce pretty often. So a mature female lionfish is only 1 year old, and she can produce tens of thousands of eggs, and she can spawn every 2 to 3 days. So that's a lot of eggs, right? And so you can see why there's a ton of potential for them to establish these really, really large populations on coral reefs and other structural habitats in the region. So if you go to the next slide, and this one's not quite in focus, it was taken with an ROV actually, but because of those high rates of reproduction, again, early in the 2000s and then over the last decade, we saw really, really high densities of lionfish throughout their range. This is in Cuba, actually, I believe, but we saw them all the way up in Bermuda, the Bahamas, all throughout, again, the Caribbean region, Mexico, northern Gulf of Mexico. And they became really quite a concern for a lot of different people. If you go to the next slide. And so not only were there lots of them, but they eat everything, right? So they're really indiscriminate predators, and they don't care what's in front of them, just as long as it's in front of them. And so it's not uncommon to see these guys have maybe, tens of various highly colored reef fishes in their stomachs. And that raised a lot of alarms for a lot of people, right? Because you've got this very, very abundant ambush predator on these reefs, consuming a large number of native fishes that are often in places where the reefs are already stressed for lots of different reasons. If you go to the next slide, so they don't have very many natural predators either. At least that was the thinking when they first showed up. You've got this, again, very colorful fish that kinds to extend its pelvic fins and kind of has these really, go back one, sorry about that, really kind of dramatic displays, right? And so, predatory fish like groupers and sharks and snappers and moray eels and things like that tended to not, know what to think of these guys. And so really what happened is that a lot of folks kind of took measures into their own hands, and they decided that they were going to try to remove these lionfish so they wouldn't cause irreparable damage on these reefs, right? And so that's really where this story takes off. And so when I started working in the Cayman Islands in about 2008 or so, or maybe 2009, the lionfish were just starting to show up there. And one of the things that is really unique about the Cayman Islands is that they have a very healthy reef system for the most part, or at least relative to many other places in the Caribbean. And they have an intact predator assemblage with large numbers of Nassau groupers, for example, and other species like that. But anyways, the dive masters there started to remove these fish using pole spears. And again, another important part of this story is that prior to that time, in 2010 or so, maybe a year or so before that, the Cayman government prohibited spearfishing in the islands. And so if you go to the next slide, there was this really interesting kind of relationship between all of the reef fishes in the Cayman Islands and the divers. They're almost like pets, and they swam without fear of divers, and they would come up and like to get their backs or bellies scratched, or they just want a little love, right? And so, and that I thought was a really important thing. When I started to work with these guys, after they speared tens of thousands of these lionfish, sometimes they would get off the spear, or they would just throw them over the side of the boat. And the groupers or tarpon or whatever were there, they would think that they were being fed. And they tried to handle the lionfish because they're venomous and they have these large spines. They would often spit them out, and they would kind of, display or exhibit this really adverse reaction, like you just had given them, just a really bad piece of medicine or something like that. And so, but people didn't think much about that, and they just assumed because they're venomous, right, with all these spines, that they weren't going to be a palatable food item. But after some period of time, what happened is that the fish actually, the predators in the system, learned how to handle the fish, right? So they would orient them when they ate them, head first with the spines down, and they found them to be, by all accounts, pretty palatable. And so it wasn't long after that when divers would get off a boat, and you see in this diver here a little yellow pole, I can't point to it, sorry about that, but you can see that that's a pole spear. And so the fish would recognize that a diver was actually in the water with a pole spear, and he was thinking, these guys are going to go get some lionfish. I think I'll follow them around. And that's what they did. And so what happened then is when the diver would spear the fish, that the groupers would actually come and eat them off the end of the spear, right? And over the next year or so, they would get a little more aggressive at that, and and they would take them off the spear before the diver could actually put them in the bag. And so, and that was, it was kind of frustrating for the divers in one sense, because they were going to use the fish to make tacos and things like that, right? But the groupers found them to be just as tasty. But probably about a year after that, what was really, really interesting is that the groupers quit following the divers around, right? And when the divers would jump over the side of a boat and they would see the spear, right? They're so smart, these fish. And they would say, oh, that dude's got a spear, but I'm not going to wait for him to clunk around on this reef to find a lionfish. I'm just going to go point it out for him. So the grouper would swim somewhere on the reef, swim straight back to the diver, right? And then he would say, here's the fish. I don't have time for you to kind of swim around. And so that's what they would do. They would point out the fish, and then the grouper would start to eat them. And then the important thing, though, is soon after that, there were more and more accounts of groupers and sharks and other fishes that were actually just consuming these lionfish on the reefs without the aid of a diver, right, with a spear in his hand. And so if you go to the next slide, this is actually a big Nassau grouper with a lionfish hanging out the front of his mouth that he was able to capture all on his own. And so if you go to the next slide, in the end of my story, the important point here is that in the Cayman Islands, if we're able to take care of the reefs and we're able to have a healthy and vibrant intact reef fish assemblage, that Mother Nature can kind of take care of this invasion problem for us. So it's not completely gone, and lionfish still provide an opportunity for photographers and other people that are interested in seeing them, but their numbers are really, really reduced relative to what they were a decade ago, and the system seems to be coping quite well. But again, the issue is that not all the reefs in the Caribbean are in good shape, right? We've spent, or we've had a tremendous impact on reefs. They're either by overfishing, nutrient pollution, anchoring and all sedimentation and things like that have really put reefs in bad shape, not only in the Caribbean, but around the world. And we need to really make an effort to try to restore and conserve those reef resources so they're resilient, right? But the take-home message here is that resilient reefs can take care of themselves if we let them. So you bet.
Thank you for that. And I am so impressed that you didn't use any numbers or anything on those slides. So well done. Next up, we've got, and I think we're going to hold the Q&A and all for the end. So if you all don't mind holding your questions, but don't forget them. Next, we're going to move on to Kendall Fitzgerald, who's coming to us live from Key Largo. And Kendall, you can take a minute to upload your presentation while I introduce you if you'd like. Kendall graduated from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, with a degree in geography and environmental studies and a minor in geospatial information systems and technologies. She graduated in 2019. She's grown up with an immense passion for ocean conservation and has conducted fieldwork already in Fiji, Australia, and Curacao. I always get that wrong. I hope I got it close. With a variety of marine organisms, including sharks, whales, and coral. So she's interning with the Coral Restoration Foundation in the Keys, and this experience has given her a tremendous opportunity to learn more about the conservation of coral reefs, while also spreading their important message through effective and strategic communication, which is so close to my heart. So with that, Kendall, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kristen, for that introduction. Like Kristen just said, I have been interning with Coral Restoration Foundation for the past 5 months, and it's been such an incredible experience. I come from a pretty conservation-minded family, so it's been really nice to, sort of plug a passion of mine and bring it to Coral Restoration Foundation and learn all about the restoration practices, and in turn share all that I've learned with you all. So thank you so much to Katie and Florida Craft Art as well. I'm very excited to be here. Okay, so to start off, I'd really like to emphasize the fact that corals are in fact animals. They've actually been around for about 500 million years. And during that time, they've survived 5 mass extinctions. So they are traditionally extremely resilient, like Dr. Frazer was saying. They are one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. And for that reason, some people refer to them as the rainforests of the sea, which is something that I like. And they really do perform a lot of vital ecosystem services. Okay. So it's actually been found that at least 500 million people rely on coral reefs as a source of food, to protect their coastlines against storm surge and erosion, and also as a source of income. They've been found to have an economic value that is estimated to be just under $10 trillion globally. So they're very important. Unfortunately, as I'm sure some of you are aware, since the 1970s, reefs around the world have really been degrading at an alarming rate. Coral reefs are actually one of the most threatened habitats on Earth. And this picture right here actually showcases what could often be referred to as a coral graveyard. These really are just the bones of dead corals, and you can see that green is the algae growing on them. Okay, so Florida's coral reef is, let's see. Okay, so Florida's coral reef is actually the 3rd largest barrier reef in the world, and it is the only barrier reef in the United States. It is 3rd behind the Great Barrier Reef and the Mesoamerican Reef. It stretches for 365 miles. It starts in the north up in Palm Beach and stretches all the way to the south in the dry Tortugas. So Florida's coral reef is unfortunately under threat. In the last 50 years, it's been estimated that we've lost about 97% of our very dominant structure building coral species, the elkhorn and the staghorn. This picture right here shows an elkhorn coral. So as we stated, they are under threat on a global level, and the level of die-off that many of you may have heard about that's happening on the Great Barrier Reef is extremely similar to what happened down here in the Florida Keys in the 1970s. So as unfortunate as our story is, it's really can be looked at as a cautionary tale to a lot of researchers and collaborators around the world. So hopefully their reefs don't become as degraded as ours are. So I'd like to go into a case study of CARYSFORT Reef, which is located in the Upper Keys. It's where Coral Restoration Foundation does a lot of their work. And it was once known as the crown jewel of the Florida Keys. This is a picture of CARYSFORT Reef in 1975. This picture is so beautiful. It really shows these massive elkhorn coral. It's been estimated that they're between 3 and 5 feet tall, and you can't even see the ocean floor. This is essentially a scuba diver's paradise. So this is that same reef just 10 years later in 1985. As you all can see, the elkhorn are really starting to degrade. They're dying, and there's a really massive overgrowth of algae. This is that same reef in 2004. And this is that reef in 2014. This can really be regarded as a coral graveyard. So as unfortunate as this story is, it's really given Coral Restoration Foundation a very, very unique opportunity to develop interventions and methods that aren't only used here in Florida, but also around the world. So we were founded in 2007, and we are regarded as the world's largest nonprofit marine conservation organization dedicated to restoring coral reefs to a healthy state in Florida and globally. In order to do that, we focus on 3 main foundational touch points, which are restoration, education, and science. So we primarily focus on growing and outplanting staghorn elkhorn and boulder coral. So in this picture, the staghorn are on the top, the elkhorn are in the middle, and the boulder coral are on the bottom. Though we focus on these, we actually have a total of 11 species in our nurseries. In order to grow corals, we use a process called propagation. And within propagation, what we do is we cut off a portion of a coral colony that's hanging on a tree, and then we take that portion and bring it out onto the reef, along with other fragments of its specific genotype. And those will grow. And then that fragment that that colony that we took the fragment off of will actually regrow whatever arm that we took from it, essentially. So we did take our first colonies from the wild, but as of right now, we are 100% self-sufficient. And as a matter of fact, we actually have some genotypes that no longer exist in the wild. So on the subject of genotypes, we have genetic banks that are actually designed to preserve genetic diversity. And genetic diversity is extremely important because, once again, as Dr. Frazer was saying, resiliency is extremely important in coral reefs. So if we have, as I'm sure you all are aware, climate change is one of the largest factors affecting coral reefs today. So more specifically, ocean warming and ocean acidification. So if we discover new genotypes that are more resilient to these new changes, then those are the ones that we actually want to be outplanting on the reef. We work with over 322 genotypes across the 11 species. So this picture right here shows the way that we actually grow our coral, which is a coral tree. The picture on the left is a newly installed coral tree. As you all can see, it's extremely clean. Those fragments are very tiny. And the picture on the right is actually that same exact tree, just 9 months later. Those corals have begun to fuse together, and they are about the size of basketballs. So the coral tree is very widely recognized as one of the most efficient ways to grow certain species of coral quickly. So this is a picture of our Tavernier nursery, which is the largest coral tree nursery in the world. And it has a total of 500 trees in it. It spans about 1.5 acres, and I have definitely gotten lost down there a time or two. And it actually, within those 500 coral trees, we actually can grow 30,000 corals. In total, we operate 8 coral tree nurseries, and within those nurseries, we can grow 45,000 corals to be reef ready. So once we grow those corals, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we actually plant them out on the reef. So after fragmenting them, we place them in these black bins. We then swim these bins up to our boat. They are then submerged in these larger blue bins that have seawater in them. So then after we take them on a short boat ride out to one of our reef sites, we then attach fragments of the same genotype about a foot apart from each other, and then using a marine epoxy. This picture on the right shows how chaotic it can sometimes be with that many people out planting. You really have to be very spatially aware because it's easy to accidentally kick other people, and if you kick their out plants, they're not super excited about that. So we really have to be spatially aware and practice very good buoyancy, which has been a really nice practice for me as a diver. So after outplanting, our science program is in charge of monitoring our outplants. In 2017, our data showed that we have an average survivorship of 77% across all of our sites and species. So our procedures are working. In addition to traditional pencil and slate methods of data collection, we actually have implemented the use of photomosaics, which is what that picture on the right shows. With photomosaics, we have a diver that has a PVC pipe rig that has 2 GoPros attached to each end. And then after everybody has completed their outplants, one diver will swim laterally across the entire site, and those GoPros will take thousands of pictures. Those pictures are then stitched back together using a computer software system. And as I said, they form a really, really nice image like this, which is very clear and gives us a lot more accurate assessment of how our outplants are doing from month to month and year to year. The science program also has a lot of collaborations with research partners, one of those being the Florida Aquarium in Tampa, which is local to a lot of you. So since our start in 2007, we have returned over 140,000 corals to the wild. And this picture is very cool because this is actually CARYSFORT, which I just talked about. And so this picture on the left is outplants after 9 months on the reef. The picture on the right is those same outplants just 2 years later. So this is really a story of resiliency and optimism. So in order to get more involved with Coral Restoration Foundation, if any of you are divers or snorkelers, you can participate in one of our dive programs, which basically gives you kind of a day in the life of what it means to be a coral practitioner. If any of you are closer to the Keys and want to volunteer on a more regular basis, you can find more information about that on our website. And if you know anybody who has a need for a presentation from us, as you know, we can come to you virtually. Please get my contact info and I can put you in touch with the right person. And finally, you can visit us in person. If you're down in the Keys, we have our Exploration Center in Key Largo. If you want to get more of a week-by-week update, we have a weekly newsletter called the Coral Chronicles, and then you can follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And finally, I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for allowing me to speak tonight and listening to me, and thank you to Florida Craft Art for allowing me to have a presence. I'm very excited to be here.
Awesome job. Thank you, Kendall. That is another good news story. we love those and awesome pictures that you had. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce Paige Lansky, who's with Tampa Bay Watch. She joined Tampa Bay Watch in January 2020, and just before the pandemic started, She's responsible for coordinating the Bay Grasses and Classes program and assists with various restoration projects and educational programs. She's worked in environmental ed and natural resource management across the eastern United States from the mountains to the coast. Paige graduated from Michigan State University with a Bachelor of Science in Zoology, and she specialized in animal behavior and neurobiology. She's passionate about communicating environmental science in a way that's easy for all of us to understand. In her free time, she enjoys, you ready for this? Herping, which is looking for reptiles and amphibians. That was a new one for me. She enjoys searching for native flora, hiking with her family, kayaking, and gardening. Take it away, Paige.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm glad I could teach you about herping. Now you just got to come and join me a little bit so we can go searching. But thank you so much for having me today. Again, my name is Paige Lansky with Tampa Bay Watch. Tampa Bay Watch is a nonprofit organization. We have two facilities, one at Tierra Verde over by Fort DeSoto, and our new or semi-new 2020 Discovery Center at the St. Pete Pier. So today I just wanted to introduce you a little bit about some of our habitat restoration work that we do at Tampa Bay Watch. I'm going to try to keep this as fast as possible, and I'm going to talk as fast as I can, but it's really hard for me. I get excited when I get to talk about what I do. So for anybody who doesn't know, just some brief information. Tampa Bay is huge. So it encompasses nearly 400 square miles, and the watershed is even bigger, meaning that area that drains to the bay is 2,200 square miles. So I think what's important about that is when we talk about, impacts on the bay, we're talking about more than just those coastal communities that are right on the coast. We're talking about four counties, four very different counties that eventually lead to Tampa Bay. So what activities impact the bay? We could talk about this for a half hour. This could be a whole PowerPoint in itself. But just really briefly, coastal development is a big one. So I think the last number I saw was we have approximately 3 million people in the Tampa Bay area with 500 people moving in per week. And that's probably even higher now because that was a pre-COVID number. And with that comes habitat destruction, habitat degradation, shoreline alterations, widespread dredging and filling. You have these shipping channels that are built with these large shipping vessels, which increase wave energy, and of course, something we all recognize, eutrophication and pollution from stormwater runoff, as well as wastewater treatment plants and industrial discharges. Things have gotten a lot better since 1980s, but we've had a lot of policies changes that have helped, but we still have more work to do. So that's where we come in. Our mission is to foster a healthy bay through environmental education and outreach, community stewardship, and habitat restoration. So just a little bit about our restoration work. There's a lot of things going on in the screen, and you don't have to remember every one of them, but just this gives you an idea of some of the projects that we do. And this isn't all of the different restoration projects we do, but we have coastal cleanups, seagrass plantings and monitoring, oyster reef installations, and native plantings. Really the take-home point, though, in this slide is, as I look at this, I see one single Tampa Bay Watch staff member. And everybody else in all of these pictures are actually community volunteers or youth volunteers that have come out to help us. And I think that's really what is important, and that's what we really try to do at Tampa Bay Watch. So all of our restoration work is done with community members. So the goal is to get them out there and get their hands dirty and to get that experience. And that way, we can increase stewardship in our community, and we can create environmental advocates in Tampa Bay. So that's our goal. I'm just going to talk about two of those today, and that is our native plantings and our oyster reefs. This picture was taken at Fantasy Island, which is a cool island, a cool site out in Old Hillsborough Bay. And you can see the plantings going on the shoreline, and you can see the oyster reefs happening waterward of that. Both of these, our plantings and our oysters, are part of our Living Shoreline projects. And I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but in case anyone's never heard of a Living Shoreline, I just kind of wanted to clarify about what that was. Living shorelines are composed of natural elements that can change, they can grow, they can migrate over time, unlike your hardened shoreline up on the top there, which is a permanent structure that breaks down over time. And it doesn't allow for that intertidal zone, which is that area between low and high tide, to be connected. And our living shorelines often incorporate both the plants and oyster reefs, as you see in this image here from one of our sites. We don't have time to talk about every one of these, but I do think it's important just to talk about these ecosystem services that these living shorelines, that these intertidal wetlands, as well as oyster reefs, can provide to coastal communities. These are services that both of them help make us more resilient in the face of climate change. As we get greater storms, with sea level rising, et cetera, they both absorb and dissipate wave energy, so less flooding and erosion occurs. The plants will soak up stormwater from upland areas, and they hold it in their super spongy soils, and that reduces flooding. The plants will capture and store greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. The oyster bars will stabilize shorelines by slowing the water and kind of holding that sediment in place, while the plants actually have this really vast network of roots that holds that sediment in place as well. They both filter pollutants from upland storm water, and they prevent those pollutants from entering the bay. And they kind of work together, as we always say, to act as the kidneys of the bay. Just to throw some numbers at you, I've read that 2.5 meters, which is I think about 8 feet, of mature salt marsh can actually absorb 50% of wave energy on its own. And another number is a single adult oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day. So these provide some pretty amazing services to the people in these coastal communities, as well, of course, as the wildlife habitat that they produce. They act as juvenile nurseries and and foraging areas for terrestrial wildlife as well. To get these plants in the ground, we have two different programs. Our community plantings and our Great Bay Grasses and Classes program. Our community plantings involve volunteers of all ages and types to come out and help us restore coastal wetlands. So, groups can range from corporate groups to local communities to Girl Scouts and Boy Scout groups that get to come out and just participate in a day of plantings where they can contribute to, their local areas and their local parks. Then we've got our Bay Grasses and Classes program, which is the program that I coordinate. So I'm obviously excited to talk about that one. This is a program where students from all over the Tampa Bay area grow their own native plants, and then they transplant them at restoration sites. So students will actually go to a harvest site, and it's a local donor site, which allows us to pull plants, and they pull plants for their nursery, and they bring them back to their school, And we've built a nursery on their campus, and they plant those plants into their nursery, and they care for them for half a year to a year. They make sure the salinity is right in the nursery. They check for any pests, and they control algae, and they care for the plants and monitor it until they're ready. And when the plants are ready, they go out to the transplant site and they transplant them with us. They only actually will transplant half of their nursery though, because they take that other half and they recycle it and thin it to fill up their nursery again. And so it just creates this sort of cycle, which makes the program a very sustainable way to grow the plants. And it keeps the students and the schools, I think, continuously involved and invested rather than just getting out there for, one planting and moving on. So here's just a before and after image. So this is one I think we did with community volunteers. And here is, I believe this is 24 months. So this is 2 years after. So sadly, I don't actually know what site that was at. I believe that's at, it's in Hillsborough County. I want to say it's E.G. Simmons Park was where that planting took place at. So 2 different programs that do our oyster bars. Our oyster shell bars is our first one we're going to discuss. These are made up of mesh bags of fossilized shell, and they will recruit oysters and form a natural reef. So we'll sort of stack them up on each other to form a natural reef. So first, we get this marine-friendly fossilized shell that we get locally mined, and we bring it out and we dump a huge pile at our site, or a site near our site. And the volunteers go and they shovel all of the shell into these mesh bags. So you can see them shoveling. We actually use PVC pipes with the bags inside them, so it's easier to manage, but we shovel them. So what we do is we fill as many bags as we can on that day, and we take them out to the site, and we actually do like a fireman's line where we pass bag to bag to its place in that oyster shell bar. So, hopefully the goal is to be able to recruit oysters, but it also holds that sediment in place and acts as a barrier or a breakwater. And then we have our oyster reef ball installations. So these are, you've probably all seen these before. You may have heard them called oyster domes instead. We're calling them oyster reef balls now. But these are marine-friendly concrete domes. They are, the point is to sort of encourage oyster and attachment and growth. But, these things are 100 to 200 pounds. So these really act as great breakwaters to sort of absorb that wave energy and protect everything behind them. And so they're really good in, higher wave energy, maybe better than just the marsh or the oyster shell bars on their own. So the process at Tampa Bay Watch, we actually mix the concrete, we build these molds, we pour the concrete into the molds, all with the help of volunteers, of course. And then once they're dry and they're ready, we take them out to the site where we, a couple volunteers at a time, because they are so heavy, of course, will lay those domes in place. And that's how we create our oyster reef bars. So you can see sort of in the back, you have these new fresh oyster reef balls. And then in the front, you have these older placed reef balls, which have oysters growing on them. So you can really see the difference over time as these start to grow oysters and create habitat. So not only are you holding that sediment in place, but you're also creating habitat for wildlife and for the oysters themselves, which we know can be so beneficial. One more thing I just want to point out is that these things really work the best together. So this was at MacDill Air Force Base. We went out with a group of students and we planted a bunch of salt marsh plants, a coastal wetland plant that's common around here. And as you see in the after picture, a big storm came through and it knocked out most of those plugs. They didn't do very well at all. So we thought, if we're going to keep losing the sediment, what can we do? How can we get these plants to take off? So we thought oysters. So we added an oyster shell bag bar right in front of where we wanted to plant those plants, and we replanted them. And you can see what a difference it made. So once we put in that oyster shell bag bar, it actually accrued sediment, meaning it added sediment behind it. So there was more sediment for that salt marsh plants to be able to take off and grow and root themselves. So they really work the best together when we can do them. And often in our projects, as you saw with Fantasy Island, we'll use all three, the plantings, the oyster shell bags, as well as those big oyster reef balls. So last but not least, I just wanted to touch on this. A common question we get is, I live in this shorefront property and I can't really build a living shoreline because I have this bulkhead or this hardened shoreline and it's way too expensive to change. So what can I do? So this is something that we like to tell people in those situations might be beneficial. And I know, Kristen, you said you had one. So I think she can attest to how easy these are to install. So you actually just hang these from your dock. They're made out of recycled oyster shell and marine friendly rope. And you just hang them from your dock and they sit in that intertidal zone between that low and high tide. And they recruit oysters to grow on them. And over time, you will start to see you really have increased the amount of fish coming to your dock because you'll see them foraging from these little oyster gardens. They really can produce a lot of food for fish to come and start grazing and foraging from, as well as the fact that they filter water for us. So they're just cool to look at and people will always ask you questions. So they're a fun thing to have. And if anyone is interested, feel free to contact us at Tampa Bay Watch, and we have some already made and ready for you to pick up if you need them. So go ahead and contact us if you're interested. And last but not least, if you have any other questions or you're interested and want to know more, you can visit us at tampabaywatch.org. We are also on all of the social medias, and you can find links to that on our website as well. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me, you guys.
Great. I will clap on behalf of everybody. Nice job, Paige. Thank you. Thank you all for those great talks. I'm looking at the clock. We've got a few minutes to now address what can we do? So these are great stories of hope. And sometimes it kind of feels like if you read the newspaper or anything on the internet, you can get really bummed out and you think, well, I'm not going to make a difference. I think all the panelists and I agree that actually you can. So what I did here was I simply did a very non-scientific poll of my colleagues here at the USF College of Marine Science. These recommendations are neither endorsed by USF nor the College of Marine Science necessarily. They come from good hearts of good people. And I didn't rank them or anything. I tried to pick out what I thought were some of the more interesting, maybe some that you haven't heard, probably some that you have. But this is not an exhaustive list, but let's have some fun going through at least the top 5. So this one I thought was interesting. Who's heard of plogging? This was a new one for me too. This apparently comes from a Swedish phrase called plocka up, which means to pick up. So they combine that with jogging to make plogging, and you can go plyaking and you can go plucking. What it means is go pick up the trash. So often I see people walking the beaches and just walking by, the litter. So this is the idea that, gosh, if we all really chipped in and just picked it up, that would make a really big difference. And in fact, there's this whole trash dash community that I learned about. And in fact, there's one going on this month kind of globally. So if you Google trash dash, you'll find that. Shown here on the bottom here are pictures of Guardians of the Gulf is a new project we just started with Boys and Girls Clubs of the Suncoast. And I've never seen kids so excited to pick up trash. We did it in the form of a competition, and it was just really fun. And so they really energized me to get into it too. So go plogging, that's number 1, or plucking, if you will. But the video on the left really shows you the significance of stormwater runoff is really a big challenge in our area. Anything that's on the streets and in your fertilizers on your lawns is going into the water, right? And so this is a big problem that we can, to some extent, control. What's suggested is to ditch your fertilizer and shift to what they call water smart landscaping. And I think Tampa Bay Watch is a good resource for this, Paige. Is that right? So if you want to learn more, I think Tampa Bay Watch would be a good resource for you. Tip number 3, if you want to become a climate advocate and vote for leaders, number 1, who support science and this kind of work. One I wanted to throw out that you might consider, because there's a lively local group, is called the Citizens Climate Lobby. And this is the idea of putting a price on carbon. So having the big companies pay for it. What I find interesting about this is there is a kickback to all citizens that you can use however you want. So that part of it is worth investigating. I'm not going to go into all of it now, but if you're interested in this kind of work, they really need people to write letters to, share support. And they've made it really easy by doing this from your cell phone, for example. So I've listed our local contact here in St. Pete. If anybody's interested, he's waiting for your call. Become a citizen scientist. So again, lots of opportunities through the organizations we've heard from today. There's all sorts of opportunities. This one lends itself to anybody with a cell phone. iNaturalist, I don't know if anybody's heard of this, but it's really a global program, and it's all about taking pictures of what lives in your backyard or on your walk or whatever, and contributing to a global database that helps scientists track biodiversity. This is a really cool program. It's been around a long time, and it's really easy to use. So take a look at that if you got a chance. There's no cost, it's free, and like I said, easy. There are some programs that are less easy. This one, easy. Another tip, which I think is a really important one, and maybe not one that's often found on lists, of what to do to help the planet. Support STEAM programs that support underrepresented groups. Solving these big challenges facing our oceans really requires a diverse set of voices at the table. And it's well reported that ocean science is one of the least diverse geosciences. We at the USF College of Marine Science are really working hard on this problem. Trying to build a pipeline of programs from Guardians of the Gulf that I mentioned earlier to programs for graduate students. So if anybody's interested in these, give me a shout. There are lots more that we can go through. I'm not going to bore you with a slide like this with lots of words. This presentation will be available to everybody after the fact. Katie's going to make that happen for us with her magic. So these are additional suggestions. I wanted to make a comprehensive list for you, but I'm not going to go into the details. I did want to mention, however, that I believe it's Elizabeth who knows how to dispose of your paints and arts materials in a responsible way. Katie, correct me if I'm wrong in that, but I think she said that she's got that resource. So
we're planning on doing a program about that.
Okay, great. And lots more that you can do. Simple things like washing your clothes on cold makes a big difference in the end. And I'm not going to go through this whole list. It will be there for you to look at when you have more time. I want to get to the Q&A now, but if you want to educate yourself further, I personally think that Project Drawdown is a really helpful resource that has really cool graphics that you can use too. And for kids, Global Weirding, it's a funny name, but it's a really great set of videos on YouTube for kids about climate change. So, watch them with the child in your life. And I think it's a good thing to kind of pass on. So with that, this is my favorite quote. Of course, I had to share that today.
To please come by and see our exhibit. We have 40 artists, 80 pieces of art, and it will run through October 23rd. It's called Environmentally Engaged, and it's sponsored by Kathryn and Edward Rucks and David and Becky Ramsey, along with Regions Bank, the state of Florida's Cultural Affairs, and also the city of St. Pete. It's a wonderful exhibit, so we do hope that everyone will come see it. We're open 7 days a week.